Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for all coming. It's lovely to see so much interest in our history and some very cool women. Now, can you hear me in the back? Is it all okay? Yep. Talk louder? Better? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about these three women. Please do not adjust your eyes. It is the slide, not your eyes, okay? It's not a very good resolution. They have a few things in common. The first one is that they're all linked to our museum, which I think is a real taonga of the city. They also share other commonalities. They all loved Northland. And they could all be seen as, they were born within kui of each other in the last decades of the 19th century. And all three of them became what was called then modern women. That is, they were independent, they were bent on following their own path, and they were quite happy to shrug off any conventions. Two actually chose to retire to Whangārei, and the other thing that they share is, unfortunately, they're on the peripheries of being forgotten. So we're here to celebrate their lives today. I'm not an expert, so please, if you've got any other stories or anecdotes or letters or photos or anything like that, please let me know. That would be fantastic. I've also bitten off a bit more than I should have. Each woman deserves an hour on her own. So it's going to be a bit of a cook's tour. We're going to briskly go through their lives, and I'm mostly focusing on their Northland connections rather than their entire lives. So, and the other warning is I've got images because I like looking at pictures when I'm listening to people talk, but they don't necessarily tie in with what I'm saying. So I've cobbled together photos where I can of their lives, or in Kitty's case, her paintings, but they don't necessarily tie in with what I say. So I hope you don't mind floating with that.
Cool. I'll just pop this out.
Sure.
Go for it.
Can I keep going?
Yeah, keep going. It's all right.
Right. Okay. So first, we're going to start with Jane Mander. She's arguably the most famous of the lot. I had never heard of her when I first came to Whangārei in the early 90s. Went to the museum and saw this writing turret. And first of all, I was captivated because I thought, what a cool space to write in. But I also landed up thinking, Whangārei has a writer? Who is this? I don't know her at all. And this was pre the piano times, you know, the piano, the film, being catapulted Jane back into fame. But I went to the library, which was the old library then, and asked for her book. And they said they had the story of a New Zealand river. They had to go and get it from the stacks. And when it came out, it was very moldy and smelt really musty. But the writing, so vivid, I thought, depicting the gum fields and the milling, particularly in the Kaipara. So it leapt off the page. So then I thought, right, I have to know more about this woman. So who was she? Oh, hang on, where have I gone? She was born in Ramarama in 1877. Her father was a businessman. He was hell-bent on making money, so much so that he would pursue any job, any interest. They landed up moving 29 times in 3 years. So much so that he sounds like he was completely focused. So he came home, his wife had just put all the family's weekly wash into kerosene tins to soak. And he came home and goes, right, we're moving tomorrow. So he was that sort of man. But he landed up in the Kaipara, running a milling business. He did land up making his fortune. They moved to Whangārei, to this house here in Hatia Drive. And I think they were quite a swanky family for the time. Contemporary called them the bigwigs. He was MP. He also bought the Advocate, and that's where Jane started her writing career. She was sub-editor, and she was in charge of ladies' page. And then she got sent over to Dargaville for a year to run the newspaper there. So she was pretty cool. When you go into the museum, you'll see that there's a beautiful big dresser there from the Mander household at all. Jane, however, I think was cut from a different cloth from her father. She used to also write socialist articles for a newspaper called the Maori Lander, and she was very strong socialist views, and her pseudonym was Mander Lloyd. So she had one letter. They're very entertaining, her articles. She went to Australia to the Child's Court, and she said she arrived there full of hope and curiosity. And she was appalled when she discovered that it was presided over by what she called a fossil. And this old man had these children coming up in front of her, and his method of testing whether they were good or bad.
Excuse me, do you want us to do with that?
Can I shout like that? Right, I'm good. I've been a teacher for years. I can shout at those people in the back row. Right. Should I do that?
We'll give it one more try.
One more try. So this old man, his way of testing whether the children, how depraved they were, was to ask them about their multiplication table and the 10 Commandments. And when they failed, which they invariably did, that was when he would find the parents. And she describes one mother who's got tears in her eyes, and she's saying, I've got 9 children. They've never been in trouble before, and I don't have any money. But justice must be done, you know. And so Jane was very indignant, but she finished the article by saying she couldn't wait for a better future, a more hopeful one, where people would actually look at why the children were going wrong in the first place. And she says, hallelujah, Andy. And she goes, when that happy day arrives, we shouldn't have fossils at so many hundreds of pounds per annum, presuming to judge children who don't get enough to eat. We shall have sane men and women who begin at the beginning as sane folk should. And there won't be any fossils, because in a sane state, the fossil will be the unpardonable sin. He will be given a good dinner and lulled to eternal sleep with the latest anesthetic. So that's our Jane. While she was writing in this turret, she was dreaming not of being a journalist. What she really wanted to do was be a novelist. So she persuaded her father to send her to Columbia University in New York to study. So she went there in 1913. She did extremely well in her studies. She was in her early 30s then. She got distinctions. But money was always tight, and she never seemed to quite eat properly, and her health was always an issue. And then, of course, World War I broke out. And so eventually she dropped out of her studies. Of course, she was also trying to write at the same time, got a job with the Red Cross, and became very involved with women's suffrage. Afterwards, in 1920, finally, The Story of a New Zealand River was published. Came out in London and New York, and they were very positive about it. She was seen as a fresh voice from the Dominion. New Zealand was, not so much, hey. They appreciated her descriptions of New Zealand. Very visceral stuff. So I want to give you this example. The Story of a New Zealand River is set in the Kaipara, and it's about the milling. And this is a kauri tree that's been chopped, and it's ready to tip. And she writes, the whole world seemed to lurch, slowly, slowly. Then the top branches shook, the great trunk swayed, the foundations cracked. The whole tree gave one gigantic shiver, poised for an instant, suspended, hesitating, and then, realizing, as it were, the remorselessness of fate, it plunged forward, filling the whole visible world and cracking horribly till its longest branches had caught on the ground with a series of tearing, ripping sounds, preliminary to the resounding roar as the massive trunk struck and rebounded and rolled upon the earth. "Well, that's over," said the boss cheerfully. "I guess we can go to lunch now." I think that was very much based on her father with his very cheerful, self-serving interests. But New Zealand did not appreciate it because she wrote about sex. And she wrote about a loveless marriage and a woman falling in love out of it. And so it was seen as definitely not a book for children. If you wanted to borrow it, you had to go to the librarian who would get it off a secret shelf and pass it to you. But Jane was on a roll by then. 1921, the Passionate Puritan came out. 1923, she moved to London, worked for publishers there, mostly as a reader, but did some editing as well. Strange Attraction came out that year. Now, I love this book. It didn't get very good reviews, but it's about a woman editor in Dargaville. And I think she captures the town and the settings wonderfully. 1924, Alan Adair came out, and it's held to be her greatest book. But you know, New Zealand was still not embracing her. And you can see the simplicity inside the turret. And I think sometimes this is perhaps a symbol of her life or metaphor for her, because her life was always bared down to the bare essentials, very little money. In fact, she used to say to people who wanted to be writers, "Don't be writers, be typists. You'll be a lot better off." And it's ever been thus. One of Oscar Wilde's epithets were, "Bankers talk about art, artists talk about money." So she shifted, I think, perhaps to a more international art audience. Perhaps she was looking for more money from a wider audience, but also she was cosmopolitan by then. She'd been away from New Zealand for 12 years, and New Zealand was so diffident about her. So in 1926, The Besieging City came out. It's got a New York setting. I've been told it's a lovely read. And 1928, Pins and Pinnacles came out with a London setting. Now, here she is with her friends in the Mander garden. I believe that archway was the jawbone of a whale. She always had lots of friends wherever she went. She was apparently lots of fun, but quite disconcerting when you first met her, because she had quite a deep voice and she gave her opinions very directly, very succinctly. But she was also very kind. So even though she was so short of money, she supported some writers that she felt really their work should be out in the world. So she'd give them what she could. At this stage, her family was begging her to return. Her parents were old, and they promised her if she came home that she'd have a house, time to write. It would be lovely to have her back. She finally agreed and came back, but unfortunately for her, her mother died before she got back in 1932, and she got stuck with her cantankerous, very selfish father, who she had to look after. There was no time to write because she was running after him. She did get some work. She became a radio personality and gave talks about things like women's rights and women in ancient Greece. And she did reviews, but she never wrote another book. And in her letters, she writes of this deep frustration of not having the time and the space to write. But her love for New Zealand never waned. When she returned, she said, "It is the most beautiful country, one of the most picturesque in the world, but I, like other New Zealanders, did not appreciate its beauty until I saw the rest of the world. England and France are wonderfully beautiful, but their charm is of the postcard variety. Everything is just so. and New Zealanders visiting them long for a piece of ruggedness, some of the Dominion's wild beauty. If England had our hills, the people would go crazy over them. If they had the Tangahuas in Sussex or Surrey, they would be considered one of the most celebrated beauty spots in England and would be spoiled by tourists. And she particularly loved the view of Whangārei from Manu, you know, looking over the harbour and the heads. She said it's as beautiful as anything in the world. And I love her because she loved Whangārei too. She said that it's got a beautiful setting. And she said the only thing we lacked was sense of history of the old buildings. And having seen some of the lovely photos, you know, in Forum North of some of the buildings that they did pull down, which of course were contemporary for her, I do think, oh, it is a tragedy that so many buildings have gone. But we have got our museum who is helping to preserve our history. And she always said, Whangārei's got its own beauty. It's got a sense of freshness. And so when her cantankerous father finally passed away, she actually retired here to Lovett Crescent. But unfortunately, she died a few years later in 1949 when she was 72 years old. I love this one. She's the one on the far side, and I think she's got quite a raffish look. And this is a little anecdote I found in the museum, written by he was a bachelor farmer at Mangatapiri. And he had met a Miss Mander and been really taken by her and decided to take her wondered if she'd go to the ball with him. So he turned up to her house to invite her. It was the first time I'd been to her house, and I found it a bit of an ordeal, as the Manders did things in rather more style than I was used to. But in spite of my nervousness, I didn't upset my teacup on the drawing room carpet or anything like that. And when I finally plucked up the courage and asked if she had come to the ball with me, she looked quite pleased and accepted the invitation. I remember congratulating myself as I rode back to Mangatapiri that I was making some headway at last. The day of the ball came, he got himself all dressed up in his evening suit, but he said, you know, you can't ride 9 miles in an evening suit, so he pinned up his tails, and it looked like rain, so he pulled on overalls and oilskins and put on boots, and he had his dancing pumps tied by their laces around his neck and his dancing gloves in his pocket wrapped up in tissue paper, rode into Whangārei to the livery stable, stripped off everything, unpinned his tails, and went very jauntily down her driveway to pick her up. He describes the scene. She answered the door herself, but to my surprise, she was not wearing a ball dress, and she was not looking a bit pleased to see me. Well, I said rather nervously, here I am. So I see, she said, but you're 24 hours too late. The ball was last night. And with that, she shut the door. Never one to suffer fools, our Jane. The next one we're going to talk about is Kitty Vane. Now, I met her through the library, through the museum too. I went to an exhibition in the Mimringa room, which had her paintings in it, which were nice enough. But when I saw this driving cap, I thought, oh, how jaunty, how stylish. And I had this lovely image of some Isadora Duncan type woman hooning around Whangārei in a lovely sports car, you know, at what was it be, 20 miles an hour in those days? You know? So I thought, I have to know who she is. So she became more and more interesting as I looked into her. She's the daughter of Gilbert Mayer of Mayer Park fame, and his wife, Kitty Sperry, who was a very famous portraitist of the time. And they actually met when he went to get his portrait done by her. He was seen as a war hero, and which feels uncomfortable these days to say that. But he had also was judge of the what was called the Native Land Court. So he was a bigwig in himself. They had one son, but he died in infancy, and then Kitty was born. But when she was only 2 years old, her mother died. And I think she must have had quite a lonely childhood because she was raised by a Scottish nurse, largely. But she always loved her art. So she, when she was 21, she went off to London to study art in 1912. Here she met became good friends with 3 other Kiwis. Now, if you know anything about these women, please let me know. They were Betty Woods, who later became Mrs. Richard Seddon, Esther Barker, who became Mrs. Norman Hope, and this is the one that I'm really excited about, is Beatrice Dobie or Dobby? What do we say? I've seen both spellings, so I don't know, but she became Madame Vernon. So she's the one of Dobie track fame, and her father was one of Whangārei's early photographers, and she grew up here. So these 3 did their studies together, and when they finished, they went off to the Cotswolds, where they had 6 weeks under Frances Hodgkins. So they said it was a fabulous time because they would paint in the mornings and she would give them criticism in the evening. When that finished, Beatrice and Kitty buddied up and they traveled around the UK and Morocco painting. And I like this about Kitty. Kitty said, Beatrice had a heavy head cold and no French, but still somehow got herself engaged to a Frenchman. So if you know anything about her, please let me know. World War I broke out, and so they joined the VADs and went to work as voluntary nurses in the Malta military hospital. Here she met Ralph Vane, who was the 3rd son of a baron. This is their castle, but I don't suppose they lived there. But they got married in 1917. The newspaper said the bride wore a dress of pleated white georgette with a stole of white and gold brocade and a high tiara of orange blossom held in place her old lace veil. It was a small wedding, but full of lords and ladies, and I suspect this is where the money came from, although probably her father was rich too and she was the sole heir. But she then had enough money to travel for the rest of her life all around the world. She and Ralph traveled madly for the next 10 years, and this is when she started signing her paintings K, the initial K, and then Erini Vane, and so that was a nod to her New Zealand roots. Unfortunately for them, in 1928, when he was just 36 years old, he died. And I don't know whether he'd been gassed during the First World War or had injured in some way, I don't know, but that was it. She was now a widow. So they had these lovely travels. She did have an eye for the exotic, but what was she really like? So I've got a couple of views of her. One friend said she was a great character. Her solicitor and friend said Kitty was a strong character with a definite personality. She was a person about whom one could not remain neutral. Those who knew her well either only tolerated her or loved her, and the latter was very much in the majority. She was a generous person and gave not only money but much of herself to people and causes in which she took an interest. She was a delightful friend, occasionally infuriating, but always lovable. And then to give us another viewpoint, I found this in a diary, 1947, another artist, John Moore, wrote, received the alarming intelligence that the Honourable K. Ariane Vane was here. Mrs. Vane, rather awful, looks down her nose and has an affected drawl. So there you go. She traveled extensively, Europe, North Africa, South Africa, Canada, North America, Guatemala, and the Pacific nations. In some ways, it looks like quite an enviable life, but she never remarried. I'm not sure if she was lonely. I haven't found out that she had a constant traveling companion, but she did have the gift of friendship. And so, for example, when she'd come back to New Zealand, she and her old buddies would go off into the countryside to paint together. She did landscapes, as you've probably picked up now. She did them in gouache because she was too impatient for watercolors to dry, for oils to dry, and watercolors weren't permanent enough. Once the painting was finished, she just wanted to roll it up and move on. So her work process is described like this. Most of her work was done quickly. The longer she took over a painting, the less satisfactory the end result was likely to be. Her output was prodigious, and at times, in out-of-the-way places, she would run out of paper. If she saw something that she wanted to paint, She would turn over a completed painting and produce one on the back. She was even known to cut the bottom out of a dry cleaning box and use that when paper wasn't available. But it was a hobby for her because she had money, so she could travel around. What she really loved was, apart from being a socialite, and she would do things to promote New Zealand artists wherever she could, but she really loved game fishing. And so she used to go out of Tutukaka a lot. And very annoyingly for me, there was a game launch named the Kitty Vane. So when I was going through the old newspapers for her name, I kept getting all these fishing competitions coming up. So that was a bit of a frustration. She'd popped back a lot, and she became known as a painter of the Pahutakawa. She had a passion for them, and she wrote, "These trees are part of our scenery and are much beloved, and I seem to be the only artist who troubles to tackle them, or tries to depict them. Perhaps vainly or badly, but I do try." And if you, like me, and have tried taking photos of Pahutakawa, it's very hard to capture their splendor. She retired to Lang's Beach. Do you think this is Lang's Beach? I thought it might be. I don't know enough. So she was there in the late 50s, early 60s. Apparently she had a very bad car accident, and I think that put paid to a lot of her traveling and her independence, and she died in 1965. However, there may be people out there who know more about her than me, so I would love to hear about it. She was often dismissed as being a chocolate box painter. Her reply was, "They say my pictures are too pretty, but there's already enough ugliness in this world." And I think, having survived 2 world wars, she's probably got a point. So that was Kitty. And now we come to our last one, Eleanor McLaglan. And I didn't meet her through the library. I met her because I'm really interested in New Zealand's early woman doctors. And in all innocence and ignorance, I bought this book, Stethoscope and Saddlebags, and was enchanted to discover that she was Northland's first woman doctor, and which was great. And then it's quite funny because she came here because when she came out of medical school, she couldn't get a job anywhere. She didn't really want to be a doctor in the first place, according to her. Her parents were very forward-thinking and said, "You're going to go to university and you're going to become a doctor." And she said, like any good Victorian girl, I let down my skirts, pinned up my hair, and off I went. Her book is also very funny about her training and her lecturers. I do recommend it. It's a good romp. But she got the job. When she came out of university, nobody wanted woman doctors. She had no family money, no family connections. She only got the job at the North Wairoa Hospital because they couldn't get a real doctor. So they said to her, "It's a temporary position until we can get the real thing." So she came up now. And then I was enchanted because when I went up to the medical museum at Manu, walked in, and they had her saddlebags and stethoscope there and her full medical kit. It's a treasure trove there, guys. We are so lucky to have it. Huge kudos to those people who put it together. It's a Mary Poppins bag. It's not too big. It's sort of about like that, but it's amazing what they could fit into it. There's a glass cabinet, and it's not too big, but it's got 3 shelves, and they're full of these beautifully crafted instruments. So this talk is really now going to be her instruments on there, and I'm telling you about her life. So, but they're just such beautiful things. I thought I should share them. So she came, and it was, of course, quite a diverse community. She had the Maori communities, who she found very warm and welcoming. She loved them. She had the Dalmatians in the gum fields, and she said, oh, they were excellent citizens. And then what she referred to as the splendid bushmen who were doing the milling. And she's with them. She was mostly looking after injuries because it was such a dangerous livelihood. In fact, once the men brought a cart with a man inside it who had a big kauri log rolled over her. So she went out quaking, and she looked in, and she started checking him all over, and she couldn't find any broken bones, no injuries. He was just very stiff and sore. But when they told her what had happened, it had been raining. It's Northland. It was very muddy. So as the log had started rolling over him, he just got squashed further and further and further into the mud. So one very lucky man there. And these are how exquisite they are. You see, there's a metal case because, of course, it had to be strong because she was riding everywhere, and lovely leather pouch to go with it. And all these instruments she had. Also, she would have had her little bottle of chloroform, probably might have been ether, but most likely chloroform, and a cloth, because in those days they were called the rag and bottle people. Anesthesia was in its infancy, and so, you just popped a little bit on the cloth and popped it on the person's nose, and off they went. So this is it opened. Her description of the area is interesting. The district was poor, very poor. The timber and gum industries were finishing. The river flats were still undrained, their fabulous richness as yet untapped. Over it all, round it all, pervading it all was the river. Now she's put that in capitals. The great grey sliding river. No chattering, laughing ripples, but somehow remorseless, even a little sinister and forever muttering dark secrets to itself. Today, the flats of that river drip milk and honey, or rather milk and butter fat. With the aid of fertilizers, even the formerly barren gum country smiles with green grass. She was it when it came to doctors, so she even had to do dentistry, different pliers for the different types of teeth. I've got one a bit later on, and I went. Inside is engraved the type of tooth you attached it to. So no, is it good? Not going fantastic. Thank you. So she went out in all types of weather and conditions, and she writes this about her nighttime rides. Those rides, all alone in the silent nights, were full of witchery. The only sounds were a gentle rustle of leaves in a wayside tree, the soft thud of my horse's hooves on the dirt track, perhaps a hunting moorpork calling here and there. And how the stars shone and twinkled. Occasionally there was a lunar rainbow, ghostly and beautiful. Even on moonless nights, I could see the river gleaming and follow its course. A few years later, during First World War, I understood how the German bombers could follow up the Thames to London, its target. So, of course, being a doctor, she was really into hygiene. And are you wondering, how did she manage it? Well, she had her sterilizer. And yes, it too went on the horse. And so what she had was she got a saddle from the Boer War. And she said it was slightly designed differently. So it had two rolls that went down either side of the horse's backbone. And she would put her saddlebags each side on D-straps. And then at the back, where the rolls protruded past the horse's tail, she could hang her sterilizer in a canvas bag. And then she put her larger instruments into it. So you see, there's her forceps. And isn't it beautiful how they fit together so well? And then she would have been able to heat it from underneath to sterilize things. Now, when you go to the medical museum, which I hope you will do, let me just warn you, you might need a strong stomach. When I've been learning about what these instruments of torture are for, I really admire the engineering, I really admire the doctor's skill, and I really didn't want to be on the end of any of those operations. So she talks about going out at night as well. There were other nights when gentle spirits hid and the spirits of wind, rain, and thunder took control. If not too boisterous, they could be exhilarating. But when really roused, they buffeted and bullied me into a soaked and wretched traveller. I remember one dreadful night with the rain pouring in sheets when I was called up 5 times. Each time I had to go out to the paddock, catch and saddle up a protesting horse, more and more unwilling to be caught. And no wonder, for all my clothes, the saddle and the horse were utterly drenched. Here's some more of her things. She's got clamps, she's got the little mirror, she's got even a little saw for minor amputations. But she said she'd never felt so full of vitality in her life. Everything was so exciting for her, and I should think she was very fit from all that riding. She wasn't just looking after human patients. She also got called in for animals as well. So one farmer offered her £5 if she could set his daughter's broken leg, but he'd give her £25 if she could save his pedigree heifer. Unfortunately, she didn't, because she was also always strapped for cash. This is one of my favorites. This is the syringe. It's only about this big. Again, beautiful engineering. It's a little metal case for the glass syringe to go into. And she said, with her patients, sometimes I had to take a firm stand to help my human patients. I was called in to see a child aged about 10 and found that one side of his chest was completely full of fluid. I said the fluid must be drained out. Oh no, said the mother and father, no operation, we will not allow it. I said I only wanted to insert a rubber tube and drain the chest. Well, if that's all, you may go ahead. I put the child on the kitchen table, sterilized the rubber tube and the instruments on the kitchen stove, turned mother and father and family out and locked the door. Then I lightly anesthetized the child to the accompaniment of blows upon the locked door and demands from the family to let them in. I did so and witnessed an extraordinary scene as father fell, sprawling headlong into the room. Mother stumbled over him and the rest of the family on top of them. Fortunately, by the time the family had recovered themselves, the child was coming out of the anesthetic and a convincing stream of thin, purulent fluid was flowing into the pie dish I'd taken from the kitchen dresser. The child made an uninterrupted recovery. So she was here for 3 years, then went on for further training. All she ever wanted to do was work in a hospital. She landed up working in the school's medical service instead and did fantastic work with kids with for their eyes, for their ears, for goiters, became very involved in health camps. But good things come to those who wait, and World War II came along and all the male doctors went overseas, and finally, age 60, she could get her job in the hospitals. She finally retired in 73, moved to Auckland and wrote her memoir when she was 85. And I just would like to say it's a cracker of a read, I think. But what she said of her time up in Northland, looking back, those seem to me to have been the most soul-satisfying days of my life. People came to me for help. I did the best I could for them. Sometimes a patient might have been better treated by a better doctor if one could have been obtained, but no such person could be reached. I used everything I had of mind and heart and body. And so that's our lovely 3 women. Just want to say huge thanks to the museum for their help and for looking after our stories, especially to Laurel and Alice, who dug out information and artifacts for me. And big thank you to John Swinney and Bill Segru at the Medical Museum because of all their help and patience with me with that knowing little. And we've got local legend photographer Ellie Smith did all these gorgeous photos for us. And Otago Art Museum for the use of some of their images from Kitty's paintings. Leslie Marshall here for giving me a Northland Society of Arts catalogue of kitties years ago, and who knew that it would come so handy. It was great. Thank you. And lastly, I would like to say thank you to Mac. She has there's a lot of work that goes into these, setting up, running around, checking in with us. And I have found that I've learned so much from these talks, and I think it's a really special thing. So can we just give back a clap? Now, we're running a bit late. Do you want, I'm happy to open for questions, anecdotes, any information you have. And please, anybody who knows anything about Beatrix Stobie, let me know. I got, how do I say this? I got an illegal copy. Somebody had photocopied it and had, so it was a gift to me because they knew I loved Jane Mander, which is theoretically against all copyright, but yes, la 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 la. I think so, and yes, I feel fairly safe that no Mander is going to come after me. There are two very good Jane Mander biographies. An early one, I think, written in the 1970s, I think, by Dorothea Turner, which is very good. And then an excellent one written by Ray McGregor, more recent one. I think that came out in the 1990s. And they're both very good reads. Yeah. I bought that off Trade Me. Yes, and I was just very lucky because I was Googling early woman doctors and that book popped up on Trade Me. So I got it, and yeah, I'm so pleased. So it's probably out of print again, yes. It always breaks my heart that there's so many pearls that just go out of print. Yeah. That museum is just full of stories. You can feel it, can't you? You walk through and you go, oh, yes.